people of the United States. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hello, and welcome to George Washington Slept Here, the civics education podcast from Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, where we explore American history, civics, and the idea of liberty through conversations with some of our favorite thinkers, writers, and leaders. I'm Jason Raia, Chief Operating Officer at Freedom's Foundation and the host of George Washington Slept Here. The format is simple, a long-form conversation with a friend of Freedom's Foundation where everyone can learn something new. Before we go any further, a little housekeeping. We encourage everyone to subscribe to George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you get every new episode as soon as it comes out. We love hearing from our listeners, so please email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with your comments, questions, or suggestions, and hit us up at Freedom's Foundation's social media at FFVF on Twitter and on Facebook and Instagram at Freedom's Foundation. Today's interview is with David Eisenhower of the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches in the Annenberg School of Communications. Hello, David.
Jason, how are you?
I'm great. So you've been a longtime friend of Freedom's Foundation. Normally, I would say tell us where you were born and raised, but because you've been part of Freedom's Foundation for so long, tell us where or when you first knew of Freedom's Foundation.
Well, let's see. When would I have known of Freedom's Foundation? We are sitting here looking at each other across the table, and between us is a picture of me with my grandfather in 1962, just before I went off to prep school. And I would have been aware of Freedom's Foundation in Valley Forge by then, because I almost went to Valley Forge Military Academy. My grandfather was very fond of Valley Forge and the area. He revered it. He felt that there were three sacred places in America, Valley Forge being one, Gettysburg being another, where he lived, and West Point, where he'd gone to college. And so I would have been aware of Freedom's Foundation then in a dim sort of way. I became aware of it in a big way when my father and mother are making plans to move from Gettysburg at the end of my lower year at Exeter. Because my father is becoming executive vice president at Freedom's Foundation. So when they moved here to Phoenixville, I'd say about 2 miles from where we are sitting right now,
right?
That is when I became aware of it, and for the first time, heard my father on radio broadcasting advertisements for the foundation, and advertisements about their contests and various things that they were doing in that period.
So let's go back to the beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Because you have, in some ways, a very unique experience because of your family.
Well, right. I've always been aware of that fact from my earliest conscious thoughts. I was born at West Point.
Okay.
In March of 1948. And at the time, my father was teaching English at West Point. He had been... he was a 1944 graduate. He served in the European theater. He had occupation duty, which is in Austria, which is where he met my mother. And I believe his first stateside assignment when he got back was to join the faculty at West Point. He was always that kind of person. He was a student. He was a scholar. He's a writer. Wanted to be a writer. Mm-hmm. His father oriented him towards West Point, and he's very close to his father, so he went, but he was somebody who was always going to wind up in the literary or history field, which he did. He wound up writing 12 books. So he's teaching at West Point while going to graduate school at Columbia.
Oh, interesting.
So he was getting an advanced degree.
And is your grandfather at Columbia as well yet, or?
I think he might have been, or this would have been just before he became president of Columbia, or it might have coincided, and I hadn't actually made that connection, but you're correct. So that's where I'm born. My first memories of the world are being with my grandfather in France in the summer of 1951. He'd just been appointed commander of NATO. And I remember him boarding an aircraft. I remember his uniform. I remember the aircraft. In fact, I saw the aircraft about 4 years ago in near Tucson, Arizona. There's a great big place called the Boneyard.
Sure.
Where surplus aircraft are kept. I saw that very aircraft.
And you saw the same aircraft.
Same aircraft is identified by a plaque. So I remember that, my grandfather's uniform, and I remember going back to West Point, which is where we remained when my father went off to Korea. And then we went through a succession of Army bases. We went to Benning, we went to Leavenworth, we went to Belvoir. My father then joined the White House, the Pentagon. He was stationed at the Pentagon, and then kind of on loan to the White House, and spent the last 3 years or so working with my grandfather as a confidential secretary. In the White House, assigned there as an Army man. When my grandfather left the White House in 1961, my father took a leave of absence from the Army to help him write his memoirs. The Army was fine with that. Year one, they extended him for a second year. He went back for a third year and a third extension, and they said, I think the story I heard, and I don't know if this is true, the Army told him, well, there's only one individual in U.S. Army history who's ever had 3 leaves of absence, and that was Robert E. Lee. And you're not quite in that league. So my father is faced with a choice: stay in the Army or leave the Army. And that's when Freedom's Foundation came calling, and so he moved over here, and that's when I became familiar with the operation in its full glory.
So you. For those who don't know, General Eisenhower and then President Eisenhower was, for the first 20 years of Freedom's Foundation's existence from 1949 to 1969, he was either chair of the board or he was chairman emeritus. And so this connection to Freedom's Foundation was incredibly important in putting Freedom's Foundation on the map and bringing in lots of people. Someone you talk about in your monumental Eisenhower War book, name comes up over and over and over. Who was on the board here was Omar Bradley.
Right.
And that's, of course, directly related to General Eisenhower. Normally I would ask about influences, but you talk about in a number of places the people that sort of paraded through your house, your grandparents' house that you got to know up close and personal. Tell us about some of those people that you met in your younger years.
Well, when I look at my grandfather's appointment calendars and I see the things that he did on television and so forth, I realize that there were actually a lot more people there passing through than I was even aware of. But I would say a typical afternoon at the Gettysburg Farm. I've got about 5 friends over. We're playing basketball in the rear parking lot, which is right next to a well that dates back to the American Civil War. We had a basketball net hoisted there, and maybe Dwight Eisenhower and Harold Macmillan walked by. Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister of Great Britain, or something. Happens to be on the property. That happened all the time, and so I was around a lot of political people, and I was around a lot of military people. And interestingly, I know that Bradley, you mentioned Bradley, I know that Bradley and my grandfather did several joint interviews in Gettysburg at my grandfather's office. And so he was a visitor, but I didn't happen to be around when Omar Bradley was visiting. I was there when General Montgomery was visiting and other personages from the war. I did have an opportunity in the late 70s when I began to research a book that I wrote on the European Theater of Operations, Eisenhower at War, 1943 through 45. I had an opportunity to spend a day with Omar Bradley.
Oh, really?
And to interview him. And in fact, we've been moving stuff out of my office over the last several days because of a mishap. That is a tree falling in the office.
That's a mishap.
But I recovered the cassette tapes of the interview that I had with General Bradley in the late 70s. He's a wonderful man. Class of 15 at West Point, and he and Dwight Eisenhower would have had very similar life philosophies and life experiences. One of the things that, of course, drew my grandfather to this field and Freedom's Foundation, and this would have prompted Bradley to do the same thing would have been many hours and days meditating on the American war effort overseas and why we were doing that and what that required of Americans and what that required of Americans in the future. And so they would have returned home with a sense of the importance of that effort and the price of that effort and the importance of that effort to the future of America, as well as the willingness to contribute towards the end of preserving freedom and liberty in the United States. And Freedom's Foundation has, as an institution, institutions have cultures. One of the things that's interesting, always fascinating to me about Freedom's Foundation is the emphasis on responsibilities and duties.
Right.
As well as the rights, advertising the rights we have, but also promoting awareness of the responsibilities and duties we have to the country. That's exactly what Eisenhower and Bradley would have taken away as one of life's lessons, one of the affirming history lessons of World War II.
Absolutely. And it's and the defense of those rights is one of the key responsibilities that they would have seen. And there is a quote from his speech, Eisenhower's speech at the end of the war, right, where he is presented with, essentially the key to the city of London.
It's called the Freedom of London.
Yes, yes.
And the address is the Guildhall Address, June 12th, 1945. That's a fascinating address. It's one that Franklin Roosevelt might have given. Mm-hmm. Franklin Roosevelt was not alive,
right,
to deliver the summation of the American effort in Europe. And so that devolved, that came to Dwight Eisenhower, who received a distinction called the Freedom of London. I think 4 Americans have received it.
And there's this in his speech, there is just this quintessential line that just feels so very Freedom's Foundation. He says, "To preserve this freedom of worship, his equality before law, his liberty to speak and act as he sees fit, subject only to the provisions that he trespass not upon similar rights of others, a Londoner will fight. And so will a citizen of Abilene."
That's right. Well, Jason, you came right to my favorite line in the entire my favorite speech right there, and we didn't even discuss it before we came on the air here. That is, to me, the most powerful line in that speech, because that is an affirmation, and that is what World War II did affirm.
Right.
And on the eve of World War II, we were not sure that principle was going to be affirmed. One of the things that I enjoy doing in my spare time, I'm a kind of professional reader at University of Pennsylvania, so I watch a lot of documentaries in my off hours and historical movies. One of my favorite recent ones is Darkest Hour, about Winston Churchill. And this is Great Britain coming to grips with the magnitude of the challenge that they were going to have to face in order to defend their island life and their freedom in Europe. And that was a very hard thing to face. But the movie is very powerful because it demonstrates how leaders and led kind of came together at this great moment in June of 1940 to commit themselves to doing exactly that, to defending their island life, whatever the cost may be. We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them in the hills, and so on. And it's a sort of, that's what that line conjures up in my mind. And that's the spirit that connected Americans and British in World War II.
So I'm one of the things I found fascinating, and I will be honest in saying I skimmed Eisenhower War. It is I'm hoping to tackle it. I just got it last week, but it is it is thorough. Let's put it that way. But one of the ideas I found fascinating in it that I had not, even though I've taught World War II at the high school level I had not really thought about was this idea that the Tehran, what I'm calling the Tehran Conference calculus, that there is this calculus that in order to affect the Normandy invasion and eliminate the Nazis, total surrender is what is the goal. There is, there's no negotiating with the Nazis. That it would essentially require extending the life of communism in the East.
Yeah.
That was known and understood, and that was the decision that was made.
Well, in fact, Jason, I would say one thing that occurred to me in researching the book, and by the way, I emphasize that very point of decision that you refer to. In fact, I found the beginning of Eisenhower at war by looking in front, looking behind, going back to birth, going back to end of his life, this and that, looking for a place to start a book on Dwight Eisenhower. And I came up with the Tehran Conference of 1943, which is where the Soviets confront the Americans and the British with a demand. And that is a demand that they name a commander for Overlord.
Right.
What is his name? His name is Dwight Eisenhower. This is where he appears eternally in history. The decision made there, people are always interested in apportioning credit. And one of the things that I say Franklin Roosevelt gets credit for in American history, and genuinely deserves credit, is that in evaluating the threats to freedom in the world, he was able to discern a difference in degree, not only in degree, but I think in kind, between the communist threat and the Nazi threat. He felt that we could coexist with communism, and in time we would bring communism under control. He felt we could not coexist with the Nazis. So Roosevelt makes a pact with the USSR on that basis in 1943, and there is no other way of looking at it. Historians try to rationalize this. This is dealing with enemies in succession. No, there's a clear-cut decision by the Western powers to attempt to enter into an alliance of integration with the communist world to meet the common danger of Nazism.
So the British are not as convinced, and it seems that we see that in Vernon Montgomery sort of agitating for just this idea that they if they just went directly to Berlin, they could smash the Nazis and thus arrest the Russians coming in from the east. And you're
well, the whole theory of the dash to Berlin, and that's 1944 to 45. I don't know how much history we want to go into, and so I won't go into it much, but. There was an argument between the British and the American command after the Normandy landings in 1944 over how quickly this war could be won. And the British came up with proposals that they, in effect, stood behind from July of 44 through practically the end of the war. And the whole theory of it, these proposals, was that there are very good Germans out there. And all we have to do is position ourselves to receive their surrenders, and they will overthrow Nazis. They will cast off Nazis, and they will surrender to us, and we can avoid the kind of pitched battles that are raging on the Eastern Front. I asked my father once, because I was immersing myself in all these strategy arguments, could the British strategy for World War II strikingly resembles American strategy in the Cold War. In other words, contain the Germans.
Right.
Wait for things to happen within Germany, and then win without firing a shot. That's sort of what the ring strategy was. So I asked my father, was the invasion of France truly necessary?
Okay.
He was somebody who was in it 6 months later. He entered the war in January 45 through Le Havre, where we go every spring, multiple times, because we do things in Normandy. He thought about it for a second. He said, yes. He says because the German occupation regime throughout Europe is too brutal. There was no internal force that could possibly cast it off. Now, that was also true of Germany.
Yeah.
The brutality of Nazi domination was such that internal forces were not equal to it.
This idea of that your father had, and not just him, but that the brutality of the Nazis.
Right.
I want to go to, we were talking about the beginning of the war, or not the beginning of the war, but the beginning of Normandy and Tehran to April 12th, 1945. Your grandfather, George Patton, and Omar Bradley are out inspecting, and the first they go to Gotha, the salt mine that's filled with looted art treasure and gold, which is a Hollywood staple for World War II. Is and then they go
Monuments Men.
Yes, the Monuments Men, and then they go to Oberdorf, which was a work camp. And for those who have been to the Holocaust Memorial, they see your grandfather's words emblazoned there, where he talks about how we have to remember this, that that it is so brutal, it is so awful, and he purposely goes into this one shed where bodies were piled up that Patton wouldn't even go into, and he's like, I had to see it for myself, because in the future someone will say that this is just propaganda.
Right. Well, and in fact, people were saying that in World War II, knowing better. I don't think that the American command was surprised by what they found in Germany. But it's one thing to understand that it's there. It's another thing to experience it. To experience it is to set yourself, it is to resolve, to prevent such a thing in the future. To be aware of it is different.
Right.
But I think that awareness that the German government was capable of this explains American intervention in World War II. And interestingly, there's another thing that I would call myself a semi-authority on, in that I read all the periodicals of public affairs published in America between about 1939 and 1945. And there's an undertone. There is awareness that this is a very dark chapter unfolding in Europe. There's an awareness of that. But it does not register. It does not prompt action until you experience it.
Right.
And so Eisenhower, by calling in the photographers at Ohrdruf and requiring camps everywhere to be photographed, and requiring people,
the citizens
to turn out and to lead the cleanup and things like that, meant that awareness is not adequate. Experience, it has to be experienced in some way, and that's what the picture record allows us to do. Experience of it, it's unforgettable. It's one reason why I urge people to visit battlefields. It's a reason to come to Valley Forge.
Yep.
You don't understand the ordeal that Americans went through in the American Revolution until you see these cabins that have been reconstructed here.
Well, and that idea of being in the place where something happened, and I remember this story from early on in the war. There is an escapee from one of the concentration camps who is brought to the United States, introduced to the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, who is Jewish, and tells him the story of what's happening at the concentration camps. And he listens, and then he sort of paces back and forth, shaking his head, and says, I can't believe it. And the person who had brought this survivor into his office says, Henry, you can't call him a liar. And he said, I'm not calling him a liar. I just can't believe it. It's this inability, in that there is no logic in understanding what was happening.
Well, in fact,
these concentration camps.
I had an experience with that, and this is with a very great man. His name is Elie Wiesel. We met Wiesel a number of times in the 80s. We were just at events that we happened to be at. But we were at one that was a Washington dinner in honor of the American liberators. These are the people who entered camps. And Wiesel got up And he gave a speech, which was, I'd seen him speak several times. The emotional weight of these speeches is something to have experienced.
Yeah.
I was in the rotunda when Wiesel was speaking in the mid-'80s, and wails broke out around the room. Just the power of it.
Sure.
Well, at any rate, he's giving a speech, and the first part of it is a kind of challenge. Why didn't Americans bomb Auschwitz? Why?
Right.
And then he realizes that I'm following him to the podium, and he's there. The dinner is in honor of the American liberators. And so he kind of catches himself a little bit, and he says, but I must relate that when I was at Buchenwald, I will never forget the arrival of American jeeps. And as they entered, and David is about to follow me here, it was as though General Eisenhower was in the first jeep. We were so grateful, and our lives resume, at that moment. And I was able to get up, and you have one coincidence like this in your life, you'll consider pretty remarkable. I got up, and what I was able to say was, Mr. Wiesel, you did not see Dwight Eisenhower in the first Jeep. You saw John Eisenhower, my father, in the first Jeep. He was in the first Jeep. And I discovered that years later, just picking books off my dad's bookshelf on a rainy afternoon, not far from here, in fact, on Valley Forge Mountain. Mm-hmm. And it was a photo album that he had taken at Buchenwald that day. He entered the camp with a camera, as a lot of the GIs did have, and they hid the camera.
Yes.
Because they didn't want people to feel humiliated. And the inmates insisted that they take pictures. And so I'm looking through this. And I said to Dad, what was it like? And he said, how many grains of sand are there on a beach? Incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Now, that's Morgenthal's response right there. He didn't want to believe it. There was another thing, too, and that was, this is the hard part of it, is that if the American and British government had acknowledged what they knew to be true, that would have given the Germans power over us because that would have forced our hand. It would have forced us, in effect, to negotiate for the release of people that they were holding. And we were determined to bring them down. Nothing was going to stand in the way of burying the Nazis and closing in. And so there is this devastating episode recounted in Anthony Cave Brown's Bodyguard of Lies, where early June, in and around the time the Allies are landing in Normandy, World Jewish Committee, whatever it was called, they were a negotiating partner. I believe the State Department was represented, the British were represented, the Nazis were represented at a meeting in Istanbul.
Right.
At which Adolf Eichmann offers the Hungarian Jews in exchange for 10,000 Allied trucks. In other words, let's form NATO right now. That was the offer. And the offer was declined because we're not going to negotiate with them on any basis. Yep. We are going to pave them. We are not going to negotiate on any basis. Right. This is a ghastly, tragic moment. This is awesome.
It wasn't about saving this particular group of people, or it was almost a viewpoint that was bigger, that we have to make sure this can never happen again.
And the way they did it was at Nuremberg.
Right.
By trying these people and establishing in international law that it is a crime to commit crimes against humanity. Yeah. It is a crime. And you will be held responsible for it regardless
of orders
or level of responsibility. Right. There are no sovereign rights to commit crimes against humanity and so forth. That is what prevents this long range. It does not prevent genocide in every case, but it does. It has a huge impact, I think, no one supports the principle of genocide.
Right.
Which, by the way, was a word that was actually invented by a Polish attorney, I believe, in about late 1942. The word did not even exist.
Wow.
Genocide.
Yeah.
Until mid-course through World War II. That's how astonishing this entire thing was. And as I say, that is what direct experience does. And that is why I think that I really rank that decision. I could see this when I was putting Eisenhower at War together. I could see that as one of the most important that my grandfather made in the European theater. And I don't think it was one that he thought about particularly. I don't think that it's one that he agonized about at all. It's just what he did.
Yeah. So you talk about in Eisenhower at War that that Ike's experience as Supreme Allied Commander is really a political training ground that sort of prepares him to become president.
Yeah, right.
So I'm curious in the most general way.
Let me put it this way. I'd say his presidency is an extension of that responsibility.
Okay.
Directly prepare him to be president. I think what he brokered in the war was as or more significant than what he brokered as president. The presidency is consolidation, but the achievement that is mobilizing America and the West to defeat the Nazis and positioning the world to move beyond that is the heavy lifting,
right?
And then the rest is consolidation,
right? So I'm curious if you can think about if you have thoughts about the lessons from his World War II experience, and you talk about consolidation that he brought into the presidency, and what was he trying to accomplish?
Well, I think one of the things he became aware of in the war, and this is one reason for Freedom's Foundation, is that America is a favored land. We live as early as 1837, Abraham Lincoln, in a speech, is saying that the mightiest nation the mightiest army in Europe could not so much as take a drink from the Ohio River. In other words, we're living in a kind of I wouldn't call it bubble, but we are very fortunate in many ways. And being as fortunate as we are, it is very easy to forget responsibilities. And that is what World War II was all about. We faced duty, and the question is, what kind of price do we have to pay to bring ourselves to that point of acceptance in the future? And I think the more we have activities like Freedom's Foundation, the more we promote understanding this, I would say the less cost there is ultimately to mobilizing ourselves when necessary.
Right. And I do sometimes wonder if the further we get from World War II, the further we get from even the Cold War, it is easy to forget how good Americans have it.
Yeah.
And I think when we look to those who will give anything to come here,
right,
to raise their family here,
we
see it once again, that
right,
people who understand deprivation, people who understand poverty, people who understand political violence, they're the great hope, the beacon.
We had an au pair once. She was, I think she lives in California now, but she's Italian. And I want to say this was periodically we have really, I would say, dark moments. We have sagging markets. We have a lot of inflation. We have a lot of pessimism, and that was a pessimistic era. And
I remember 19% interest rates.
19% on. I mean, this was and I remember wringing my hands and this is terrible and that's terrible. And in a way, I thought I was making kind of an impression on this Italian girl, maybe with how sensitive Americans are. And she says, "This is an amazing country." She says, "Everything works here. You don't have any idea when and the Russians are nowhere around." I mean, she's from northern Italy, and so she's conscious of the fact the Russians are in Hungary, which is not far away. Right. And I stopped, paused. Wow.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah.
For as dark as our problems seem to be, they were making a citizen out of her at one of our darkest moments. And so here we are in 2023. We're very conscious of the divide that we have in this country and the various controversies we have, and yet there's a stampede for our.
That's right.
Stampede for this country. So we live with great privilege and wealth, and I would say opportunity and things like that. But life is not complete if all you do is enjoy it.
Yeah.
That the essence of freedom is the ability to be a good person and to find a way to be a good person. And that's where responsibilities kick in. And I just drove past the point here at Freedom's Foundation where the Bill of Responsibilities is posted. That is a unique insight. It sets Freedom's Foundation apart from many, many other organizations that emphasize the notion of Americanism or rights. Everybody talks about rights. They don't talk about responsibilities. But that's reinforced by the Medal of Honor Garden or Grove and things that happen here.
I think that's exactly right. You wrote a second book, Going Home to Glory, which is this wonderful family memoir, and it's set in the years after your grandfather left the White House. He and your grandmother settle in Gettysburg, and you are there with them.
Right.
And it is just filled with wonderful stories. But I want you to relate one of my favorite stories that you share pretty regularly with our teachers when you come here, which is the day you got fired by your grandfather.
Fired? Yeah. Well, I knew he was a dynamo. He mentored me in a lot of areas, instructed me and so forth. But I would say that day, that was in summer of '63. I was working with a couple friends, and we were having fun over lunch hours. We were playing Honeymoon Bridge, two people playing a bridge game. And we got involved in a game a couple times, actually, and we thought that the general had gone back to his office downtown. We thought he was off the farm. And by Jove, he walks through the door. Oh, there we are. It's 1:15 in the afternoon. I mean, lunch hour has been over for 15 minutes. And boy, he just, bang, you're fired. And I think that's what he said. I'm not sure. I saw the lips move. Not sure what I heard. And the power of it is sort of like being around an explosion. So I picked up. We lived on the corner of the farm, so I'm walking home, and I'm asking myself, how am I going to explain this when I get home? And then the second thought that went through my head was, oops, we have a golf game this afternoon. I wonder if he's going to show up. This is 4 o'clock. The two of us were going to go out and play Gettysburg Country Club. And so I was kind of sitting in the living room to see if the car was going to show up. It did. He pulls up. And so I had one of these 7-minute car rides over to Gettysburg Country Club with him in total silence. And he was kind of a interesting driver, to say the least. He's somebody who had not driven a car in 25 years when he was relicensed by the state of Pennsylvania, getting out of office. They didn't know how to say no. So at any rate, we make the country club, and first hole played in silence, second hole played in silence, third hole in silence. On the fourth hole, which is a downhill par 4, I remember this, he says, Dave, I allow my associates one mistake a year. You've had yours. And then on the fifth, I was rehired along with everybody else. And so this was my one mistake of 1963 I was allowed. But I'd just say he ran a very tight ship. Everything about him was very organized and buttoned down. I can remember the atmosphere in the White House, the farm, same thing. Everything was very brisk. Everything moved, and you could see why. He's a very powerful personality.
So you're from the Eisenhower family. Your grandfather is this war hero. He becomes president. And then you meet Julie and her father, who happens to be Richard Nixon.
Right.
And you become part of that family, another incredible political family in the 1950s and 60s. And you go through Watergate. You're a part of the family.
Exactly.
And I'm we've never talked about this. And I've always been curious just what that experience was like, because this isn't just the president of the United States and your grandfather's vice president. It is
I think
your father-in-law.
Yeah. First of all, I mean, for the record, I think anybody who knows or meets Julie would back me up on this. I was knocked out by her. I was interested in the fact that we had family connections. It's so fine. But I was entirely focused on Julie, who's an extraordinary person. And however, I became swept up in this, and I found that in a very different way, I became as close to her father as I had been to my grandfather in a very different way. So on. So along comes Watergate. And the reason I started Eisenhower at War at Tehran is that at some point during Watergate, I became conscious of the fact that an era was ending. And I would say that era really is 1943 through 1972.
Oh, interesting.
That's a 30-year era. So the question in Watergate was, what kind of country, what kind of government, what kind of presidency are we going to have in the post-Cold War?
Right.
And what Nixon, he answers for the specific problems of Watergate, but more generally what he's doing is he's answering for decades of prerogative. At some level, I became aware of that fairly early. Now, that's not to minimize the agony I could see, the agony we experienced, but the sadness that this was befalling the Nixons. Having said that, with few exceptions, Richard Nixon has to be one of the happiest former presidents in history.
Interesting.
There's a whole book written about it called The President's Club. And the star of the President's Club, which is about the team of former presidents that happened to be alive during the Clinton presidency. They all became sort of friends. Clinton befriends Nixon, among other things. Is that I think at some level, Nixon had a broader understanding of what had happened there. He wasn't sure of it, but he had an understanding. So he's not somebody who died of regret.
Right.
And he was very useful in former years and wonderful to be around.
I wonder if you see parallels with today. When we think about the Vietnam era, that particularly that late 60s, early 70s, where there is such tension and division in the country. And for the last decade, 2 decades since...
Yeah, well, I would say that if anything, Jason, I would say that the divisions that are going around now, I would say the divisions, if anything, are deeper today. We had people with agendas in the 60s, but we didn't have whole peoples against each other. In many ways, it's deeper, but I think that the deeper reason is similar in this sense. I cannot imagine that this country deciding that it faces real problems would tolerate this degree of division for 2 minutes longer. And I think the real, in many ways, what Americans are debating right now is, do we have problems? And that has been a refrain since the victory in the Cold War. I'll take you back to an essay. It's called The End of History.
Yes.
This is a...
Fukuyama?
Fukuyama. Yeah, he was at the State Department at the time, but he writes this essay in Foreign Affairs, 1989, saying that if history can be understood as a debate about the optimal form of human organization in political society, history has ended with the victory of Western liberal capitalism, I think is the way to put it. Well, with that, the whole era, the late Reagan era, Bush era, even Clinton era, is a kind of mass celebration. Mm-hmm. It's like the final scene in Star Wars 3 where the Ewoks are celebrating the end of the evil empire. It's a kind of mass celebration. And it's a sense that we don't have problems anymore. We've arrived at a sort of, Reagan's farewell address refers to the city on a hill. If you look at that, what he's really describing is a passage from Revelations, which describes New Jerusalem. We've arrived at a New Jerusalem.
Right.
So we don't have problems. This underlies the mantras of the 90s and the, anti-government mood and so forth, and the idea that collective effort is in the way of everybody. And that has rubbed up, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years against a growing consensus that America faces problems. Mm-hmm. And that we're going to have to rekindle, I'd say, the values of citizenship. I think that's going to happen. I think it's an election or two away, but I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen because it is necessary, because it's instinctive, and because of the work of foundations like Freedom's Foundation that reminds us that this is all of these things are very necessary. That is a willingness to see things from the other's point of view, assuming responsibility for your own position in society. All of these things, people want this.
Yeah.
It's just a question of whether, A, do we have problems? I think we've decided we do.
Right.
So step two is which problem?
Right.
What comes first?
Can we agree on what the problems are and then prioritize them?
Prioritize, yeah. That's what national elections are about. I think ultimately they are about priorities.
Yeah.
And that is what our debate is. And what we're still in the habit of is thinking that we can indulge nastiness, things like that.
You teach, and this will be our last set of questions before we get to our quiz, the way we end all of our episodes. But you teach a course on campaigns and conventions, debates, the political process.
Right.
Every 4 years, and you have your students go to the convention. I think you co-teach this.
Right.
So some are going to Republican conventions, some are going to Democratic conventions, some are going to both.
We've been to 10.
What is as we're looking at another election cycle, we're already really into it.
Right.
But 2024 is a presidential election year. It's already contentious. What are you thinking that your students, when you do this course again, and students writ large, young people writ large, what should they be looking for? What are the lessons that maybe we need to remember from the past, from past elections, and ultimately, do you ever yearn for the smoke-filled rooms of the past?
Well, I think I do. The thing about conventions is that it's a gathering of professionals, and they think things, and they want to spin things to the world, but they think things. So one of the things that we're examining on the ground floor is we're getting a real close-in look at the election and what people are, what they think that election is about, and how they plan to organize their appeals and so forth, and what the score really is. It's a no-spin zone. You can't put 4,000 professionals together and have them all act and say things that they don't really think. So it's a great window what the issues are in a campaign and how they will be communicated and what the consequences of the election will be. And second, it's exposure to the people who are involved in public service. And I think that what I'm overwhelmed by, which is why I'm sitting here as an optimist when we're talking about America, is the commonalities between Republicans and Democrats as individuals. That's something I reported from 2004, called home. And we're in Boston at the John Kerry convention, and this is the one that President Obama lit up with his
Right. That's where he gave his speech.
Keynote address. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was 50 feet away from that speech. No, not 300 feet away from that speech. I said to Julie, you'd really enjoy it here. I mean, it's like being at the Republican convention of 68, same people. Young, aspiring,
Yep.
wonderful, alert, competent, friendly people. So I think that they have an opportunity. One of the bills of the Bill of Responsibilities. One of the responsibilities is participation.
Yep.
In government. What kind of people usefully participate in government? They are people who've assumed a lot of responsibility in their lives. They have families, they have jobs, they have positions and so forth. They make themselves useful. So it's a bath in that.
Brilliant. I love it. We end each episode with a little quiz. No study necessary, but just to get back to you and to knowing a little bit more about you before we close out. First question, excluding Washington and Lincoln, who's your favorite president?
And excluding family members.
Well,
Eisenhower and Nixon would be automatic. It's a very good question. And I hate to dodge it because I teach the presidency at University of Pennsylvania. What I find myself, certainly Reagan in what he accomplishes, and I liked Reagan, and I was around him and I thought he was very interesting. I like Lyndon Johnson. I think Lyndon Johnson was a very significant president. As far as enjoyed him, his campaigns until the very end, W.
Okay.
I really enjoyed W. And his father, Herbert Walker. The Bush family, the two Bushes were wonderful. I knew Herbert Walker as a congressman. So I hate to answer it this way.
No, that's I think
who ought to be on Mount Rushmore. I sort of look at it as the most consequential presidencies since World War II that are not Eisenhower and Nixon, in my opinion, are Kennedy and Reagan.
Next question. What's one thing you would want every American to learn more about?
I would want people, that's a good question. In fact, this would be fun. Constitutional law.
There you go.
Constitutional law is, if that's what lawyers did, I would be a practicing lawyer now.
For those who don't know, you actually have your JD.
Yeah, right.
Trained as a lawyer, but you've never worked as a lawyer.
Never practiced. But I think that if that's what lawyers did, I would be a lawyer.
Last question, bourbon or scotch?
My wife likes scotch, and I am a red wine guy myself.
Okay, fair enough.
Which strangely is something that I enjoyed as a kind of a college guy, and I'm sort of allergic to it or something. So we were teetotalers for years, and now Julie enjoys a good scotch, and I enjoy.
Well, there you go.
Red wine.
That's as long as you enjoy it, that's all that matters.
This is a tough quiz, Jason.
Yeah. Well, thank you to our guest, David Eisenhower. I can't wait to have you back.
Great.
I also want to thank our producers, Laura Kennedy and Sarah Rasmussen. A special shout out to friend of the pod, Bill Franz, as well as FFVF and historic interpreter Bob Gleason for their work on art and opening music. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to your podcasts, like Apple and Spotify, which helps bring new listeners to the podcast. And don't forget to tell your friends. To learn more about Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge and its Bill of Responsibilities, check out our website at www.freedomsfoundation.org and follow us on social media or email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with questions, comments, or suggestions. Thanks. Talk to you next week.